Hello? Hello. Today I'd like to speak about the constant problem of speeding traffic that we've got.
Good evening. Hello. Sorry,
Hello.
Mr.
Hello.
Parrott. Hello, it's
Yes.
Councillor
Speaking.
Stephen Fenton here, the chair of the meeting. We just got a few introductions to do, and then I'll bring you in when we're ready for you. No worries.
Okay. Cheers. Do I stay muted? Do you want me to mute?
Yes, please. Yes, please. That'd be great. Thanks for that. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Housing and Community Safety Policy and Scrutiny Committee. I'm pleased to welcome a number of officers and colleagues from external organisations who I'll introduce later in the meeting. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome some members of the Children, Education and Communities Policy and Scrutiny Committee who will be joining us for the main item for discussion, which is the community safety update, given the crossover between community safety and communities issues that committee looks at. So everybody's very welcome. This meeting is being webcast, and for those watching at home, a very warm welcome. So with no further ado, I'll begin by recording any apologies we have. I know Councillor Fitzpatrick, who's a member of the Children, Education and Communities Committee, has sent her apologies. She's not able to join us. Councillor Mason, who's a member of this committee, should be joining us shortly. So those are the two I'm aware of. If we begin with declarations of interest, do any members have any interest to declare? Councillor Barker.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. I think it's only fair to disclose that I am a declared candidate in the forthcoming Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner elections on May the 6th.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other declarations of interest from members? No, thank you very much. We now move on to the minutes of the meeting held on the 16th of February, which are at pages 1 to 4 in the pack of meeting papers. Do any members have any matters of accuracy in the minutes? I know on page 4 there were a few minor typographical errors that I've communicated through to the Democratic Services team, so they'll be actioned. Are there any other matters of accuracy that any members have? No? Okay. So I'm happy to propose approval of the meeting if someone can wave their hand to indicate they'd be happy to second that. Councillor Pavlovic. Thank you very much. Now move on to agenda item 3, which is public participation. And I'm pleased to say we have one speaker registered for this evening's meeting, who is Mr. Steve Parrott, who's a resident of Woodthorpe and has registered to speak about the issue of speeding. So, good evening, Mr. Parrott. Can you hear me okay?
Good evening. I can hear you loud and clear. Yes, thank you.
Excellent. So, welcome to the meeting. You've got 3 minutes to address the meeting. So, in your own time, please do start.
Thank you. Okay. Well, today I'd like to speak about the constant problem we've got of speeding in the 20 mile an hour and 30 mile an hour areas on Grasshopper, Alness Drive and Moor Lane in Woodthorpe. Residents are getting really annoyed about the speeding and antisocial driving. We've got the problems of tailgating, bullying of drivers, often elderly residents. A lot of the worst offenders are often parents taking children to school, hammering down Grasshopper. We've got yobs that try and drive the bends on Grasshopper as fast as they can and accelerate down the straight. There's been problems with a hit and run on Alness Drive. There's been a collision on Moor Lane recently. And the community police have been excellent. They told us to report the road. They've been tremendous. But as soon as I report the road, I'm treated like a nuisance by the police. They quote back at me an out-of-date traffic survey that was done in 2017. The survey was flawed. It was conducted at the same time as roadworks. And everybody knows that speed loggers don't work in residential areas. Drivers pass the camera daily. They all know that they're there. 4 of my neighbours warned me that it was there. People think it's a speed camera, and they all slow down. As soon as the camera goes, everybody speeds up again. I get these figures quoted back at me by the police, which are absurd, and I'll challenge anybody to come and look at this road and tell me that the average speed on this road is 20 miles an hour. We just get fobbed off. We're told to use the community speed watch. We can't do that because of social distancing rules. The speed watch doesn't work after dark anyway, so it's pretty useless in the winter months. And as soon as the camera does get taken away, speeding resumes. I work full time. I can't go out and police the roads myself. I'm at work every daylight hour in the winter anyway. 95 Alive don't want to know. One particular employee just seems disinterested, and I find it to be quite rude. And it's really time we have some kind of traffic calming measures on Grassham, Alness Drive and Moor Lane. And we don't need a ridiculous traffic survey again and the figures quoted back at us, because we all know for a fact that 20 miles an hour is not the average speed on this road, and drivers are using it dangerously and ridiculously. And we'd really like to see something done as a deterrent, because at the moment there's no deterrent whatsoever against the speeding and antisocial driver that we see every single day. Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you, Mr. Parrott, for taking the time to come talk to us. And I'm sure that's an issue that we'll pick up later in the meeting when we come to talk about community safety. So you can leave the meeting now, but you can obviously carry on watching it via the council's YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to be able to speak about it. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, we're just being joined by Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Chancellor Emlet.
That's all right. Welcome to the meeting. So that was agenda item 3, public participation. Now agenda item 4, which is the main item for discussion, which is the Safe for York Partnership biannual report. So we're joined for this item by Jane Mowat, who's the head of community safety, who I'll ask to introduce the report. I'm also pleased to say we have Andy Blades, who's the group manager for York and Selby district for North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, and Superintendent Lindsay Butterfield, who's the area commander for York and Selby for North Yorkshire Police. And Andy and Lindsay are very welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us. So I'll ask Jane to introduce the report and give us any sort of particular issues she'd like to pick out. And then I'll ask Andy and Lindsay respectively to sort of give us an update and really sort of their observations on some of the main challenges that fire and rescue and police colleagues are facing. And then I'll open it up to members for a question and discussion session. So if I can hand over to you, Jane.
Okay, thank you. So this is the biannual performance report for Safe for York Partnership. So Lindsay is actually here dual-hatted because Lindsay is now the chair of Safe for York Partnership, having been voted in September. So as always, I'm not going to go through the entire detail of the report. I will pick up the bits that I want to highlight to you, and also since the report was written, there has been more progress made in some areas, so I'll talk about that as well. So this report covers the period October 2020 to March 2021. So I'll talk first about our first priority within our community safety strategy, which is city centre crime and antisocial behaviour. So over the summer, we obviously enjoyed a brief return to shops and hospitality. We then York moved through the tier process from tier 2 to tier 3. And then obviously, more recently, we've been in a full national lockdown again. Now, during that period in December, we managed to secure some government funding to provide some COVID support marshals. So those were employed from the beginning of December to take a friendly ambassador approach to obtaining compliance to the COVID regulations. So working very much with the police and with ourselves in community safety, but not with an enforcement role. So the role has been around approaching people, not socially distancing, not wearing masks, etc., and just having a friendly, approachable conversation with them. I've provided a summary of the work that they'd done to date when this report was written for Safer York Partnership at the beginning of March. And as you can see, the percentage of people happy with their service has been sort of bordering on the 99%. So they are quite popular both with the public and also with our local business community. Obviously, since the 5th of January, we've been in a national lockdown again, so the city centre has been pretty much closed, except for essential shops and takeaway food outlets. And obviously that has naturally kept crime and antisocial behaviour at very low levels throughout that period. Since the announcement of the government's roadmap to recovery, we've started to look from a community safety perspective at what the challenges are likely to be as we come out of lockdown and as each of the stages of that roadmap are announced and take place. So I'm chairing a city centre roadmap to recovery group, which it's a multi-agency group. There's the police are obviously heavily involved, and then Make It York, the bid, all the usual partners that we would have working for the city centre. We've produced an action plan, and that includes also some multi-agency days of action, the first of which took place over the Easter weekend with a high visibility presence in the city from both ourselves within community safety, but also the COVID support marshals working together with the police, the bid rangers and public protection colleagues. So moving on then to the next priority, which is counter-terrorism, protect, prepare and prevent. So on the protect and prepare element, the counter-terrorism task group has continued to meet throughout the COVID situation, obviously meeting virtually as all of our meetings are at the moment. We've just developed a new action plan for 2021. Because much of the work that group does involve engaging with the business community. Obviously, some of that work hasn't managed to progress at the speed that we would have liked to. Within that period, the protect duty, which is part of the government's commitment to improving protective security and the preparedness of public spaces, has come into being. So consultation began on that on the 25th of January and will last for 18 weeks. That includes quite a big section around publicly accessible locations. So that's open spaces within the city. So the city squares, the parks and the places where we do see large crowds gathering. We'd already started to preempt a lot of that through the counter-terrorism task group in York. So we'd established a project to look specifically at the Fossgate, Castlegate area. And we've chosen that area mainly because it's an area of quite small independent businesses, many of whom are opening up with outdoor hospitality offerings. And it's an opportunity to engage with that business community and to get them involved in providing counter-terrorism security around their premises. So including training the staff and making sure that we've got measures in place. That piece of work has actually been picked up nationally. So it's been picked up both by our counter-terrorism regional office and also nationally by the Home Office and the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism. So they're paying quite an interest in what we're doing. And it is quite likely that we will be used as a case study going forward as that legislation comes into being and guidance is produced. So that's really good news, I think, for us. In relation to the prevent side of the counter-terrorism agenda, we've continued to have the channel panel meeting monthly. Referrals have remained steady at around 3 to 4 live cases under discussion, although at the moment we don't have any live cases at the moment. Partners have remained fully engaged and we've continued to deliver against the prevent agenda. Domestic abuse, fortnightly tactical meetings have been taking place between the Chief Inspector Safeguarding for North Yorkshire Police, the Office of the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner and Community Safety Leads, myself for York and my counterpart in the County Council. Those meetings were put in place at the beginning of the first lockdown in March last year, and they've allowed us to maintain a multi-agency focus on resources, on the commission services, and making sure that we've got a good overview of what's happening in terms of the number of referrals going into services and the number of reports that we're receiving in relation to domestic abuse. As you would expect, we've seen during lockdown periods, the domestic abuse figures have dropped quite considerably. And then as we come out of lockdown, they start to increase again. We've not had any issues with resources at all during that period. We've managed to secure additional funding, which has been put into boosting those resources. And that's for both victims and perpetrators. So we've made sure that we've maintained good service provision throughout this last 12 months. The domestic abuse bill, obviously you'll be aware that that comes into force this year, so that places a duty on the local authority. It refers to top tier authorities, so that's us because we're unitary, and then the county council. That has come with some funding, so I have listed for you what that duty includes. We've initially received some funding for capacity building, which is really to prepare the local authority for bringing in and implementing that duty. So at the moment, we've commissioned an independent consultant who's going to work between the Community Safety Partnership and the safeguarding boards, both children and adults, to have a really close look at both the services within the local authority that have an impact on domestic abuse, but also how those safeguarding boards relate to each other and how they interlink and share information and data. There's further funding also aligned to the bill, which is really good news for us in York. So we've received another allocation, which will be to actually help us implement some of those elements. So what we get from the piece of consultancy work, we will have the funding to be able to implement new projects. One of the focuses, and it's interesting that we've got colleagues here with an interest in children and young people, because one of the focuses that we are really clear that we want to drive in the city is some work around children and young people, and really looking at service provision and any gaps that we've got and making sure that we've got services in place. We've also recently become aware of some funding that's available under the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which is the Safer Streets Fund. So this is funding that the Office of the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner can bid into. York has been chosen as the primary bidding area, so we will be putting in a bid to access some of that funding. It's around about £500,000 worth of funding. It's a one-off pot, but it's to help us to put in place some safety measures specifically designed to for safety for women and girls. High risk antisocial behaviour then, so you're aware that the Community Safety Hub, I think I told you at the last time I came, we'd been doing a lot of work with the police in supporting the enforcement of the COVID regulations. So we were sending out letters to residents that have been reported for breaches. The closure and the limitation of the court service has meant that a more holistic and innovative approach has had to be taken in relation to tackling some of the complex issues that we've had, particularly during COVID. And this has led to the establishment of a number of multi-agency problem-solving groups which have worked on specific locations or specific problems that we've identified. We've worked collectively with colleagues from adult safeguarding, from housing, with the ward councillors, the local area coordinators, and also the police and probation. We've also established a daily COVID meeting, which takes place every morning with the police and colleagues in public protection. So from that meeting, we have a good overview of the previous 24 hours in relation to all antisocial behaviour issues that have been reported to the police, and also COVID related issues. That's been absolutely crucial in helping us to put resources where we need to, but also in identifying where hotspot locations or particular issues are emerging that we need to be addressing from a multi-agency perspective. And on the back of that work, as I've done for the city centre, I've also established an outer area roadmap to recovery group, again multi-agency, to look specifically at the community safety issues that we're likely to see in the outer areas of York, and to start to put in place some measures to tackle those, again working in a multi-agency problem-solving way. As always, I've provided the list of prosecutions that we've had in relation to our neighbourhood enforcement team, and also in the light of the courts not being available for everything, I've also listed some of the alternative solutions that we have also taken. The final section of the community safety plan is around serious organised crime. This is led through our Serious Organised Crime Board, which is York and North Yorkshire, and also the Disruption Panel, which again is York and North Yorkshire. We also have fortnightly intelligence meetings with the Police Intelligence Unit, at which we talk about any issues related to county lines and other serious organised crime groups where we may want to target things from a multi-agency perspective. And we also link in as well with the multi-agency child exploitation and missing meetings to make sure that we're drawing in intelligence and sharing information in relation to children and young people affected by serious organised crime. So I think that just about a very quick whistle-stop journey through what we've done in the last 6 months. So I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Okay,
thanks for that, Jane. If members can be thinking of questions to put to Jane once we've heard from Andy and Lindsay, then please do so. I'm sure there's some issues there we'd want to come back to. Andy Blades from North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. Do you want to give us an update, Andy, on some of the fire and rescue's main priorities at the moment?
Yes, certainly, Chair, and thanks very much for the opportunity to attend this evening. What I'll do is go through some of the day-to-day activities and then some of the broader aspects I think that are applicable to the City of York and the wider service of North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, and I'm sure it will reflect some of the national profile as well, which we're always, very mindful of, because it does reflect on what we see on a day-to-day basis here in the city. So on a day-to-day basis, from my priority, looking after the district that I have responsibility for, water is very much a key focus, and that might be something different to people's, from a public perceptions, understanding of what we originally see a fire and rescue service of providing that response for. But certainly in terms of the River Ouse, right the way through and to its point of Selby, where we operate on a response profile, that's very much a risk area, both in terms of people that are affected by that waterway, should they choose to go into that water intentionally, whether it's leisure or whether it's due to mental health or whether it's due to influence of substances such as alcohol, that means then they are at risk in terms of life. But also from a response point of view, for emergency responders from the Fire and Rescue Service, and indeed colleagues from York Rescue Boat, that's also an area of risk. So really important in terms of what we do around prevention for that area, but also in terms of emergency response. And the reason why that I see that as one of the key risks is because the number or the frequency of emergency incidents that we currently attend in the waterway reflects a higher profile than it does around other areas that you might normally associate us with, such as fire and or road collisions, as well as other emergencies. But it's really important as well for me to emphasise that it doesn't detract from the work that we do around fire and our prevention activity. And again, reflecting the national picture in North Yorkshire and the City of York has been very successful around fire. So we've seen a really significant drop in the number of those incidents. To paint the picture, really, the number one incident for North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, and particularly around York, is automatic fire alarms. So in premises, building, commercial premises, industrial premises, hospital settings, hotels, the automatic fire alarm systems, which are actuated by a defect or a spurious actuation, mean that our response is needed, and that is the highest demand for a response profile for North Yorkshire Fire. Very close to that is secondary fires, as we term them. So we're talking about rubbish fires, waste fires in the open, very small fires. So again, that is a significant demand compared to many other areas of incidents. But it sets the profile of where we need to focus our efforts with regards to that prevention activity. Those secondary fires, I think, is probably evident from people that are part of the meeting today within the locality. In the last week, 10 days, there's been a really significant number of fires, small fires, sort of campfire type settings right across the city. You know, we've got them almost on a day-to-day basis since the 9th of April, right through to the 17th and indeed the last couple of days. And that reflects, again, the picture across North Yorkshire, but also nationally. We're starting to see that, and we believe that's linked to some of the COVID restrictions changing alongside the roadmap. So as people are allowed to gather in groups of 6, the weather profile, warm days, but then that significant drop in temperature as soon as the sun goes down in the evening, we think is leading to people to then having small fires in that locality. So the prevention activity of that, what that involves is crews working with colleagues in partnership around from police, but also from the City of York Council as well, from the Safety Hub, to try and have those contacts. And that will manifest really in some very practical steps, such as physical visits to the locations where we know are being identified as high frequency, to try and engage with some of those people. Prevention being very much the activity to stop those occurring in the first place, keeping people safe in those events, and try and manage those and eradicate them wherever we possibly can. Specifically around water, just to give an understanding as well of how we're looking to address those issues. So from an emergency response point of view, we respond from Kent Street Fire Station in the centre of York, either with a boat from that station when the river is in flood conditions, or from the riverside when it's moored on the river. And we do that in collaboration with the York Rescue Boat, the charitable organisation who support the fire and rescue service with that response. We have identified an opportunity for us to enhance our capability from a fire and rescue point of view. So what that looks like is an increased capability, particularly around the River Foss, because we have seen that some of the occurrences that have taken place in the Foss are limited by the depth of the water, not allowing one of our boats to go into that locality. So we're upskilling some of our crews, York, Huntingdon and Acombe, to have the ability to do what we call a tethered swim, to actually enter the water physically, to be able to make a swim for an individual in that Foss environment. So that's a real increase in our capability around that particular emergency response. But really importantly, we're very much focused on that prevention activity. We'd much rather engage with the public and the people in the community we serve in that prevention environment rather than it be reactive to the actual incidents. So the Fire and Rescue Service, myself at the moment, chairs the Water Safety Forum, which is a collaboration of partners from across the city, from wider for organisations such as the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, but it does include university attendants, City of York Council, police and York Rescue Boat. So that real wide partnership. Now it's fair to say that since I've taken on the role in July last year onwards, there's been a number of meetings and momentum is now gathering with that meeting to be able to deliver some really tangible benefits. And that includes looking at some of the recent communication that we've had from members of the public around some of the safety measures which are present in the city and whether they can be enhanced. And it is important that we take those into consideration. But again, for me, it's very much around that prevention. So what we've actually done in the lead up to COVID, which really started to influence our ability to be able to connect. But for example, the nighttime economy, those businesses alongside the river in the City of York, we've engaged with them with the RNLI to provide throw lines, for example, and training. So the equipment is delivered by RNLI, and then the training is delivered by Fire and Rescue Service to staff within those premises that give us the ability then to have an immediate response should somebody choose to go into the water. So that's some of the prevention activity that took place and will continue. Also with all the new cohorts of students that join the universities within the city, they have a routine presentation around a range of safety initiatives, including the use of fire alarm systems or preventing those alarms going off in university settings, right the way through to some taking safe routes back to accommodation after a night out in the city. That means they are removed from some of those really high risk areas. They're looking to prevent those accidents occurring. So there's a couple of examples there of some of the prevention activity. Wider than that, as Jane made reference to, the counter-terrorism influence also has a reference within the Fire and Rescue Service, so our ability to be able to respond to those types of incidents. And then wider, with some of the flooding issues that we see as a county, which often do, as we know, impact on the City of York immediately. And that's becoming a much higher frequency event now for the Fire and Rescue Service in North Yorkshire. So a lot of that activity all contributes towards the Ambition 2025, which is a framework document really set out by the Chief Fire Officer, Andrew Brodie, where we want to be by 2025 as an organisation. And that also reflects the Fire and Rescue Plan set out by the current Police and Fire Crime Commissioner. So both of those documents setting out the direction for the service really emphasise some key elements of partnership and collaboration, which I feel have been active for some time, but a real opportunity to enhance those, because much of what Jane explained within the report is achieved through that partnership work in that collaboration. And certainly from a Fire and Rescue Service point of view, I think, we are still independent. It's one of the challenges for me. And what I recognise is that part of that is the continuity of the people in the Fire and Rescue Service to connect with partners. So my role historically would have moved around and had some changes. And I appreciate for partners, it's difficult then to establish those real strong connections that allow us to deliver some meaningful initiatives as a collaboration, because it moves on. So very much my emphasis is on about the continuity from my perspective in my role in the City of York, and giving people in those partnerships around me the confidence that, we are here and a very much committed partner to delivering that collaborative prevention activity. That has been disrupted by COVID, like every organisation, every person in the country. Undoubtedly, it has reduced our ability to be able to interact with partners and with the community. We've still made sure that we provide that high risk response. And that's I'm talking about prevention activity there. So where those needs are absolutely definitive, then we do the prevention activity. It's more some of the more background prevention activity that we've had to move away from. And we're looking to develop new ways of working like everyone else. So, for example, our education programme within community school settings, we're looking to give that an opportunity to do online virtual presentations of safety information rather than being in person. All that activity around our emergency response and prevention hopefully will give a flavour where we're at. Broader, I think it's also really important to recognise that, as a modernising Fire and Rescue Service, some of our real key priorities are about looking at where we are as an organisation, how we reflect the community we serve. So we're very much about as well taking the opportunity to build in that positive action, get a much more diverse workforce within the Fire and Rescue Service, so that again, that helps us understand our community and keep reducing those events to make them less and less frequent. And just to finish off, I would say, to give that as well some perspective, that North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service again is a very safe environment for the community of North Yorkshire and the City of York. And as you know, the numbers of incidents are reducing. We continue to see that. So I want to give the perspective that whilst there's continuing work always to keep that prevention going, we have been successful with regards to the prevention activity that's taken place thus far. That concludes my piece, unless there's any questions at this point.
No, we'll hold all our questions till the end, but that was really helpful, and I think, you know, quite often we sort of risk overlooking the role that fire and rescue plays. It's really good to hear some of the detail of the work that you're involved in, and which I know members have a keen interest in. So last but not least, I'll hand over to you, Lindsay, to give us a brief update, and you might also want to pick up on the points that the public speaker made around speeding and what your recent experience has been in terms of that as an issue in the city. But over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Jane for the work on the report that's been submitted as well to the meeting. Absolutely echo the comments in there, and clearly North Yorkshire Police are working very closely with City of York Council, North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue and other partners to continue to deliver during what has been a particularly challenging 12 months, I think it's fair to say. So from a policing perspective, I think it is fair to say we are now balancing some competing demands in terms of an increase in calls for service that would be classed as business as usual, in terms of 3-9 calls and calls using the 101 system, against some of the pressures that COVID enforcement has placed upon us. So members might remember at the last meeting we talked about how we'd seen that reduction in calls for service and that reduction in crime during the first lockdown. As we eased out of lockdown, and particularly at the point where York was in tier 2 and surrounded by higher tier areas, we certainly started to feel the pressure in terms of an increase in demand. Now that was both in an increase in business as usual calls around your traditional crime and antisocial behaviour, but also an increase in people reporting COVID regulation breaches. And the structures that Jane has outlined have been absolutely key in terms of being able to respond to those effectively, making sure that it was the right resource that was responding to that call. So police have led on breaches that have been alleged to have taken place by individuals, so household mixing, for example, and the council have led on breaches that relate to business premise. And I think that structure has been really clear from the start and has worked really well. As we've moved through this lockdown in particular, that's seen that daily meeting take place between my operational teams, so my neighbourhood policing teams, the COVID marshals and their supervisors, again making sure that we are aware on a daily basis of where those hotspots are in our community. And again, I think that's paid dividends in terms of being able to respond quickly to calls for service from the community. Particularly as we've eased out of the last lockdown, we have seen a significant rise in calls for service, particularly around antisocial behaviour. I'm sure members on this call will be aware of some of the challenges that we faced around the Knavesmire and the Little Knavesmire, and more than happy to take any questions on that. But again, this has to be a multi-agency response, because this is not an issue that the policing alone can enforce its way out of. So very, very grateful to partners for their support, and to Jane, particularly around the roadmap out of recovery meetings that I think are going to be absolutely key to make sure that we are joined up in responding to some of these challenges. I think the other key points in terms of our progress as a partnership, speaking as the chair, are clearly outlined in the document, but I think just to celebrate some of the success, particularly around the counter-terrorism task group meeting, as Jane's quite rightly said, that has put us very much at the forefront nationally, actually, in terms of some of the work that's been undertaken in York, and is absolutely testament to the forward thinking of the City of York Council and partners that came together at a very early stage to make sure that we are keeping the city as safe as we possibly can against the counter-terrorism threat. And I think just to highlight to members, it would be remiss of me not to say that threat has not gone away just because we've been through a global pandemic. So again, grateful for support in terms of taking that agenda forward, and it shows just how successful we have been to be held up nationally in terms of leading the way, particularly around those publicly accessible locations that Jane's talked about through the latest duty that is out for consultation. Again, we are really well placed to be able to respond to that and to be ahead of the game. So huge thank you to members of that panel in terms of our progress in that area. I could talk for hours about some of the challenges around policing during recent months, but I will pause there because I'm conscious that members have got questions. If you want me to touch on the speeding issues, I'm not aware of the challenges around that particular location, but I am more than happy to take that away and review that with the relevant teams to make sure we can get a response to the gentleman.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Lindsay. Okay, so I'll open it up now to members to make any comments on what they've heard, or ask any questions about some of the issues in the report and from the contributions from from Andy, Lindsay and Jane. So if anybody wants to comment, please raise your virtual hand. This applies to Jane, Andy and Lindsay. If you want to come back in on anything and I don't bring you back in, then please put your hand up. If anyone has a supplementary question on a main question, if you raise your physical hand, then I shall try and spot you. So if I start with Councillor Mason, I saw your hand go up first.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks all three for the updates. I suppose mine is going to be around antisocial behaviour outside of the city. I know, Jane, you said that there's been a second group set up to focus on, excuse me, out of town ASB or out of the city centre ASB. I suppose it's a little bit concerning. We had a meeting maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks ago where I talked about how people's socialising habits had changed and what I could foresee happening. And there was a lot of reassurance there from Neil Ferris that actually a lot of stuff had been planned and was in hand, and that just didn't seem to happen when the restrictions eased and people did start socialising outdoors. I just wondered why there was I don't know, it just doesn't feel like both parts have been joined up, and even emails have been copied into the comms. It's constantly referring to the city centre, and it almost feels like anywhere outside of the walls has been forgotten about a little bit.
Okay.
Jane, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I can pick that up. Yeah, and I think, firstly, that's something that I am very conscious of, is that, we do focus a lot on the city centre, and quite rightly to some, extent, because that's our sort of showcase area for our visitors. And obviously after this period of lockdown, we're keen to get the city centre back up and running again so that people can enjoy the city, both residents and visitors. So for that reason, that's one of the reasons why I've split out the two pieces of work, because I think the problems that we see in the city centre and the problems we're likely to see as we come out of lockdown are very, very different in the city compared to what we will see in the outlying areas. Now, although this meeting is specifically focusing on the key dates in the roadmap to recovery, that's not to say that a lot of the work that will go into that hasn't already started and been done. So my community safety manager, Paul Morrison, has been working very closely with the neighbourhood policing teams, looking at any hotspots that have emerged and putting measures in place as and when things occur. I think we are in quite a difficult situation at the minute, largely because we have been locked down for a considerable period this time. So that has two effects. One, obviously, as people's freedom returns, they want to get out and they want to do things, and particularly our young people who've been stuck at home for an extensive period of time are keen to get out. We saw that very, very much over the Easter holidays, when it was quite clear, particularly as we had a very good period of 2 days of really unusually warm weather for March. You could quite clearly see that the only thing available to young people at that point in time was to meet up with their friends outdoors. No other facilities were open then, so of course that's what they did. And then also the other issue that has really sort of been quite obvious is that because we have had such an extensive period of things being closed and people being confined to home, tolerance has gone down too, because people have got very used to it being so quiet and nobody about, no groups of kids, none of the usual activity. And so people are kind of, a little bit upset that things are slowly returning to normal levels. It's not extraordinary or unusual. It's what we would normally see at this time of year, but obviously we haven't experienced that for quite some considerable time. So I think the task that we've got as partners here is to manage expectations and at the same time to put measures in place. A lot of that is going to be focused around looking at activities, looking at where we can access funding to put on extra activities, particularly for diverting young people away from some of these locations where we've had problems. But all of that work has been happening. Slow time because the problems weren't there, but now being consolidated into one overall plan, really driven by these daily meetings. And as Lindsay says, I can't stress the importance of that daily discussion on what's happened, where it's happened, and being able to work as partners on a plan to address it.
Thanks, Jane. I think I saw Councillor Vassey's hand go up for a supplementary. Councillor Vassey.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it was just to maybe draw out a bit more, Jane, on this pressure that we're all feeling after being under lockdown for so long, and maybe our reserves of tolerance not being as full as they might have been in the past. What are we doing to try and ensure that we don't get to a situation where every time young people meet on the street, there's someone saying this is disgraceful, young people are behaving irresponsibly, they're meeting in a field and causing problems? What are we doing to manage expectations and to help keep the temperature down? Because I'm very mindful in my own ward that there are certain people who view any group of young people meeting outside as a potential threat or as a nuisance or as a risk or as a COVID issue. And I'd be keen to hear what the council is doing to try and manage that so that we all get along and don't start blaming each other unnecessarily.
Okay, so I think throughout this COVID situation, one of the key tools that has been really, really useful for us has been comms, and particularly social media. I know that my colleagues in neighbourhood policing teams are very active on social media too. So one of the things that we're doing alongside working to develop a plan of actions that we can facilitate to deal with some of the problems that are emerging is also having those conversations with comms and making sure that we're putting out joint comms messages from both ourselves in the council and the police around some of those things. And one of those is around levels of sort of tolerance and understanding that, you know, people will be out and about enjoying their freedom again, and the impact that has. I am very keen to do some work around that. So again, I've got contact now with the schools to do some work with the schools and have those conversations with some of the head teachers, particularly in those schools that are bordering onto the locations where we've seen issues occurring. So looking at how they can assist and also picking up on initiatives that have been used in other areas. So, for example, in some areas, they've been very active around looking at the issue of littering. I mean, obviously, we've got our Don't Be a Tosser campaign that's been going on since the previous set of lockdowns, and we're revitalising that over the summer period. But I've been looking closely at some authorities that have been working with their education colleagues to look at linking in the sort of climate change issues and littering and sustainability with some of these pieces of work as well. So getting the kids to run litter patrols. So we're starting off with a bit of a test on this. So using the police cadets to do some litter collections in some of those locations and engage with the young people. Because again, you know, one of the things that we've been very clear at in all the meetings that I've attended around these issues is that we don't want to demonise young people, and that, you know, having been stuck at home for such an extensive period of time, realistically, where would you want your kids to be? Out meeting their friends in a safe location outside, or just wandering the streets? You know, I know which I'd prefer. So we are doing that work hand in hand. So looking at a holistic approach to this, not just coming in from either an enforcement. We don't want to go there. That's not the aim. And we will use enforcement if we have to, but it's very, very much a last resort.
Thanks, Jane. Councillor Baker, have you got a supplementary?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Jane, it was just in your introduction, you mentioned that you were hoping to do a piece of work on children and young people. And I just wanted to clarify, is that the work that you've just been talking about, or had it come under a different priority? I think you mentioned it when you were talking about the domestic abuse, so I wasn't quite sure which one it was.
Yeah, so children and young people feature, you know, across practically every theme of community safety anyway. But specifically, what I mentioned in the report was around domestic abuse. So when we undertook a big piece of work 2 or 3 years ago now to do a joint strategic needs analysis aligned to looking at service provision for domestic abuse, one of the areas of weakness within that needs assessment was the data that we had around children and young people, and being able to really drill down into what service provision would look like for children and young people. So part of the opportunity that we've got now that we've got this additional funding coming alongside the bill is to be able to do something about that. So we're starting out working across all of the services within the authority who have an impact on domestic abuse, looking at the safeguarding boards that support those services as well, and then using that as an opportunity to look at specifically service provision for children and young people. And the way that we want to do that as well is to involve children and young people in that process as well as part of focus groups, etc., so that we're designing services that are really aligned to their specific needs.
Thanks for that, Jane. Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you, Chair. And conveniently, my question relates to domestic violence. So I've got a question for both Jane and for Lindsay. Jane, on the last time you came and presented to us, when I raised the issue of domestic violence, you said, well, we're not really seeing an increase in domestic violence referrals. Yet the data states that we've got over 2,000 more than 2 years ago, and 2,500 more reports to North Yorkshire Police than we had 3 years ago, and an increase year on year. So was this because the services aren't getting the referrals through from the police, or how is it that the police are getting a massive increase in reports of domestic violence, but yet you were saying that the services aren't? In fact, services were seeing a decrease.
Okay. So they're not figures. It's a bit like comparing apples with pears. If you try and compare the reports into the police, so the number of incidents doesn't necessarily reflect the number of actual crimes when you've gone through the end of the process. So two different figures. In terms of the numbers of incidents into the police, so we've been monitoring that as well on a fortnightly basis. And if you look at it, if you look at the figures, you will see that they go up and down quite significantly throughout this last 12 months, and that there is a much lower level, particularly during times when we are in some form of lockdown. Again, that's reflected, that doesn't necessarily...
Sorry, Jane, we've got 1,972 in Q1, 2,182 in Q2, and 2,059 in Q3. That doesn't strike me as a massive up and down. That strikes me as consistently large. This is on the
supplement, the page 2 of the supplement.
This is on the data, the crime statistics. Red is bad, it says, which is convenient for us.
Well, first of all, I would say red isn't bad at all in relation to domestic abuse. Red is good, because if incidents are being reported, then it means that the right levels of support are going into those cases. So red isn't actually bad in relation to domestic abuse. One of the things, we have very much encouraged reporting. So, bearing in mind these are reports of incidents. So not all of those will then reflect into referrals for service provision from the service providers. That's a different figure. But certainly the number of incidents rising, I think I have reported that to this group before, is a good thing, because it means that people have got the confidence to report. And that was one of the things that we've been particularly fearful of during COVID, that people wouldn't. Now, we have seen fluctuations in that. And as I've said, we have seen quite clear fluctuations around the figures for lockdown periods. I don't think the data that we have here is necessarily a good picture of what is actually happening in relation to domestic abuse. I have figures which I circulate on a fortnightly basis internally, which I'm happy to share with this committee, which give a much better picture of matching up those incidents through to referrals. So they show the picture of the journey, which I think is a much better data set than you're actually seeing in these reports. These are simply just base figures for incidents that get fed through to our performance team for the purposes of this report, and it's one of the reasons why we've had this conversation, I think, several times over in the last few years around the difficulty of interpreting these figures correctly when they're out of context with all of that other information, which puts a little bit more reassurance in place, if that makes sense.
In that case, can I sorry, Chair. Go on.
No, carry on. Councillor Pavlovic, and then Councillor Webb has his hand up as well. So no, carry on.
So can I then, in that case, go to Lindsay? That we've heard that these figures aren't really representative of anything. Can you break down what an incident reported to North Yorkshire Police is, and then I want to specifically talk to you about coercive control. But if you could respond to Jane's comments, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, of course. So a report of an incident is one measure in respect of domestic abuse. I think the point that Jane's making, and rightly so, is this is about insight, not just reds and greens on a table of numbers. So actually, what does that information tell us? And in order to get to that point, we need to overlay it with a lot of other information and data. So I think Jane's offer to share that with the group to give that wider context is really important, because this is a snapshot that doesn't necessarily give the full picture in terms of what's happening. I would echo what Jane has said in terms of we have seen fluctuations. We know during the first lockdown, we saw a reduction in reporting. We anticipated that nationally, that was anticipated, and there was a lot of work done to make sure that we could promote local support groups and making sure that those referrals were coming through to the right places at the local level to be able to track some of those challenges. So I think in terms of an incident would be recorded on police systems. If a crime has occurred, it would then be converted into a crime as well. So there are already two different measures there from what might be the same reported event.
Can I ask you the obvious question then? Are crime numbers going up, charged incidents or arrest incidents?
So I don't have that level of data with me tonight to be able to share, but I'm sure that will form part of the pack that Jane discusses on a fortnightly basis. And again, that's where we can overlay. I think there were also some measures around repeat victimisation that are really important as well. So actually, our reporting might be going up, but one of our key indicators is repeat victimisation reducing. Because if it is, then that would, to me, would suggest that we've got the right support in terms of our high-risk victims to be able to keep some of those people who are really, really vulnerable in our community safe. There are also other measures around orders that can be put in place. So you might have heard of domestic violence protection orders and notices. So again, there's a whole host of information out there in terms of preventative steps that we can take to try and protect victims. And I think I would just make the point that in the same way that Jane has, incidents is one measure, but actually there's so much more to this.
Thank you. Can I just,
before you move on to
sorry, go on.
coercive control, I'll just bring Councillor Webb in for a supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. And then after I get my response to this, apologies, I am going to leave to another meeting. On this point of domestic abuse, we've obviously got a level of incidents, and we've got a level of crimes, and one would expect that if you looked at the two together, you would see a sort of parallel line, wouldn't you? You'd see essentially there's a certain percentage of those incidents would roughly be actual crimes, or recorded as crimes, or taken forward. I suppose from our point of view, if we're looking at what services are in place and what referrals are in place and whether we've got the right services in place, is there a limit to our referral process just because of there is a limit to the services available? And that is where I'm quite interested, is actually, is it a situation where say incidents of domestic abuse kept going up and up and up, I'm not saying they are, but say they did, you would obviously come to a point where your services were maxed out, and in theory your line would go up and then plateau, not because there wasn't the need, but because there was no extra services. So I was wondering, is there any sort of indication of anything like that going on? Have you heard from any service providers that there's any issues, anything like that? Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, I can pick that up. So that is the whole purpose behind having these tactical meetings on a fortnightly basis, is because we've been able to monitor what that service provision looked like. And our fear, if I'm perfectly honest with you, a year ago, now, was that we would see that exact situation arise, because we were very conscious that services were a finite number. However, because of having those conversations on a fortnightly basis and being able to link that in to the commissioning process, so that's why the membership of that group is as it is, because the commissioning for domestic abuse services is a three-way arrangement between ourselves in City of York, the County Council, and the Office of Police and Fire and Crime Commissioner. And so it's been important that we've had that ability to be able to have those conversations around what service provision looked like, linking in with the service providers and having those conversations on a weekly basis as well, so that we could really understand where we were getting to a point where resources were becoming saturated. Fortunately, it hasn't happened because we've been able to inject additional funding. We've had additional funding both from government, and we've also had additional funding that the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner has put in from other funds which she oversees to support it. So we've been able to keep those services going. Now, where the challenge comes in, of course, is when some of that funding runs out, because the nationally made government funding that we received was obviously only for this 12-month period. So again, we're continuing that process. We've got no intention of stopping those fortnightly meetings until we're sure that either everything has returned to normal levels of activity and that we are in a position to be able to go back to business as usual, because we need to monitor what that looks like. As it happens, because the funding has come in as part of the domestic abuse bill, we will have that additional capacity to be able to look at that and to ensure that those services continue to be able to meet the demand going forward. So I am, I'm confident that we won't ever get to that position that you describe, because we closely monitor it. We work with the service providers, and to be quite honest, the service providers themselves have been very, very good at creating dual purpose roles, growing their resources through other elements of their funding too, to be able to support us. So it's been a really good piece of work, I think.
Thanks, Jane. Before I go back to Councillor Pavlovic, Andy, actually your blue hand, I just wondered if you wanted to come in on that issue.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just thought it might be a good opportunity to contribute to the discussion, because it links to the point I made earlier about the wider role of the Fire and Rescue Service, certainly in a modern Fire and Rescue Service. And one of the things now that our crews are much more informed, and I'd even argue educated, with regards to going into environments where they are identifying indicators of things like domestic violence. It might be sexual exploitation or people trafficking. So our safeguarding officer now directly briefs crews about the environments they're going into. And again, from my perspective, it's contributing, I think, very often to referrals that wouldn't have been there previously by the Fire and Rescue Service. And as Jane, as Lindsay pointed out, whilst it does increase the number of those referrals, which suggests there is an increase in the occurrence, I think what we've been able to do from a fire and rescue perspective is help identify some of the people that might have been hidden from these sort of activities before, and obviously put them in a safer place. So hopefully that'll just offer a bit of context to the discussion as well.
Yeah, no, that's it's really helpful to sort of understand some of the sort of channels through which issues can be identified and hopefully acted on. Councillor Vassie, do you want to ask your substantive question or make your point?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it was a question actually for Andy Blades. You mentioned, Andy, prevention measures and rivers and all of that, and you'll be aware of the recent discussion in the media about grab chains and whether that may or may not help people who've fallen in the river, and whether it's something that the City Council might be working with other agencies to deliver. I'd just be keen to hear a bit more specific information from you, whether you think it's something that we should be looking at, whether you think it would be helpful, and whether it might help prevent the kind of unfortunate accidents that we've seen too much of in past years.
Certainly, Councillor Vassie, yeah, thanks very much. The point that's been raised by the Member of Public, and it's being fed into the Water Safety Forum, is very much something that needs to be part of that consideration. So I'd be really keen to sort of emphasise that it isn't dismissed because it might have been looked at previously. It's that part of continual review to see where we're at. The current thinking is, as you probably appreciate, the complexity of it is never as straightforward as fitting the chains in those locations that might be seen as the immediate option. It might be that some of the land or some of the areas that those chains might be applied in aren't necessarily directly owned by City of York Council. So then we get into some of the issues around those landowners. But I think more importantly, the prevent part of what you say, again, and just reiterating what I mentioned before, in the areas around the river in the city, right the way through the inner and outer, there's a number of safety measures which are there at the moment, such as the life rings. I talked about the throw lines that are there to help people. But one of the other things we're very, very focused on at the moment is there has been a shift in the profile of incidents in the river. So I think originally, or sort of historically, we've thought of that being very much around a social environment. People have come into the city, enjoyed the afternoon in the city, warm weather, maybe drinking, and then chosen to go into the water as part of that activity. Certainly in the recent months, we've seen a real shift towards those incidents being much more related to mental health, and where people go in intentionally to harm themselves, and therefore that recovery of them as an individual, immediately being able to self-rescue isn't necessarily something they want to do. And then often the conditions that they find themselves in because of the weather and the water conditions mean that that wouldn't be something that they're able to do. And again, when those occurrences do happen, we do respond in that emergency environment and are relatively successful at recovering people, in those rescue situations. But it's much more around that prevention activity. I'm really keen, certainly from the chair of that group, to look at what prevention activity we can do. And for example, one of the things that City of York Council particularly have been supportive with is the manufacture of some signs to go on all the key sites, the bridges around the city, which help people have a point of contact if they are in that position whereby they're choosing to enter the water to harm themselves. So around the Samaritan message to say, you're not alone, please make contact, think twice about this action. And that's some of the alternatives doing, but very much it's not a definitive decision at the moment with regards to the chains. And I'd be more than happy to feed back in the future of that final decision that leads to consideration of that particular measure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Councillor Musson.
Thanks, Chair. Apologies, I know this might change the subject, so we might have to go back to some of the things that people want to talk about. I wanted to ask about hate crimes, because in the statistics that are in this agenda, it does indicate that hate crime reports have gone up. And while obviously, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that hate crimes have gone up, it could just be reporting. I wondered if you could speak to if there's a particular kind of hate crimes that have been reported more recently, or any other kind of trends that you've seen that have emerged that could explain why that's gone up, aside from just increased, you know, awareness and reporting.
Yeah, I don't know if Lindsay or Jane or both want to say something about that.
Jane, do you want me to go first?
Okay.
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that that is probably in line with national trends, and we knew that we would see some of those pressures, particularly around Brexit. And then also around actually COVID itself, in terms of where the virus came from. We certainly saw some of those incidents within the city in terms of hate based on people's ethnicity and race, linked directly to COVID. So I think there are some significant environmental factors that have driven that increase. I think much in the same way as domestic abuse, we would always embrace any rise in reporting, because actually it's showing that people have got the trust and confidence to come forward. And we know, particularly from some of our minority communities, that has absolutely not existed previously. So there are some new roles within our partnership hub which focus specifically on hate crime. And therefore I would anticipate there would be an increase in reporting because of that. It also features now as a substantive agenda item on the independent advisory group for York. So that is chaired, it's a York and Selby group, although hate crime is a standing item and we look at York and Selby. But bearing in mind some of the key partners that we have around the table, we are able to get that information out into some of those minority communities much quicker than we had done previously, to be able to share how to report and what support is available, which I think is absolutely key. So in terms of trends, I could probably bring some more detailed information to the next meeting if that would be helpful, just to share some of that context with you all. But again, it tends to be race hate, tends to be the more prevalent hate crime that is reported. But we are also starting to see an increase in terms of disability and also LGBT+. Again, much of which has had significant media coverage and I'm sure would contribute to increase in reporting. But in the same way that an increase in domestic abuse is not necessarily a bad thing, similarly, that increased trust and confidence in terms of people coming forward to report hate, I would see in a positive light as well.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think it'd be so useful to have so as granular a level of information as is available. That'd be really handy to have. Before I hand over to Jane, I'll just bring Councillor Baker in. You've got a supplementary.
Oh yes, thank you. I'm not sure whether Lindsay or Jane are able to answer this, but the Human Rights and Equalities Board has a task group underway into hate crime, and I just wondered whether you could just briefly say whether you're a part of that, or any quick updates on how they're doing.
Yeah, so that was what I was going to bring in on the back of what Lindsay's just said. So we do have a hate crime working group. So we are working across all the areas of hate crime to look at a changed focus really around the way that we report in. As you know, we've had some attempts previously at third-party reporting centres and looking at various locations. I think sometimes, you know, as agencies, we think that we know what people want to use to report things, but it's not necessarily the case. So we're doing a lot more work now with groups that support various communities across the city, to bring them in and to train them, and using the partnership team that Lindsay referred to at headquarters to do some of that training around giving them the confidence to become those reporting centres and linking them into us directly so that we can improve the way that we respond to reports of hate crime. Hate crime is, again, an issue that we discuss on the daily COVID call meetings. So we're looking at antisocial behaviour incidents, we're looking at any high risk vulnerability from an antisocial behaviour perspective, COVID breaches, but also hate crimes. So we do pick up where those issues are occurring. Lindsay's right, we have seen an increase in reporting, particularly in relation to COVID. That's again in line with national trends. So there is a lot of work going on, and yes, we are linked into the human rights work as well through the hate crime working group, and that group also is linking in with a county-wide group. And as part of our work around hate crime and also linked to prevent, we've just commissioned some work to be done with schools and young people. So looking at the resources that we've already produced, revamping them, changing them, and making them much more accessible within schools. So there's quite a lot of work going on around hate crime at the moment.
Thank you, Jane. Councillor Norman, you've got a supplementary?
Yeah, cheers. I was under the impression that historically one of the big problems with hate crime matters in a policing sense was always with regards to very low rates of subsequent prosecution. So I was wondering if in line with the increase that we've seen in reporting, have we seen a similar increase in prosecutions for hate crime, or is this a lot of people reporting issues that have been subsequently not really seeing much action?
Lindsay, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so again, I'm more than happy to provide that information after the meeting. It's not something that I've got to hand to be able to answer that question directly now. However, I am aware that we are in the very early stages of a restorative justice pilot that looks specifically at hate crime. And I think there are some significant benefits there in terms of increasing victim satisfaction. So letting victims have a real say in the outcome in terms of that report to police and subsequent investigation and outcome, but also opportunity to change offender behaviour. Because again, much has been the theme in terms of what we've discussed this evening. This is not something that the police alone can enforce their way out of. And there will be a number of reasons as to why individuals behave in those ways. So an opportunity to have some form of restorative practice with the victim to really highlight the impact of that behaviour and give that suspect offender the opportunity to make good what they might have done, understand the impact of what they might have done, but more importantly, change their behaviour in the future, has to be a real positive too. So more than happy to provide some further data to support the question from Councillor Norman. But again, I think there's quite an exciting opportunity in terms of restorative approaches for hate crime that's coming very, very shortly.
That sounds positive. Councillor Baker, do you want to ask your substantive question?
Yes. Thank you, and it is on restorative justice actually, but it would just be helpful to hear a sort of general overview of what the criteria for restorative justice is. I don't know if it's easy to generalise that, but in specific relation to youth antisocial behaviour and recent escalating damage and violence near the Knavesmire, are those kind of offences something that could be looked at for restorative justice for the community and the residents living around there to feel that, you know, that was an approach that was being taken?
Do you want me to pick that up? Do you want me to pick it up, Lindsay, first?
Yeah, it can do.
So, so as part of the work that we're doing, particularly around that location, we've linked in with the Youth Justice Service because one of our sort of preferred approaches around young people who continue to commit antisocial behaviour is to adopt an escalating approach. So if advice and a general conversation isn't working, then one of the next tools that we have available to us is to link in with the Youth Justice Service to access their triage service. And as part of that, that's where we would start to look at that. You know, as I've said at the outset, our aim is not to stigmatise young people as a problem. It's very much to work through that escalating approach through education, advice, and then looking at what else we can offer in terms of support, but also, you know, enforcement as an absolute final solution if nothing else works. So all of those tools are all part of that action plan that we're adopting around those outer area issues.
Just as a as a follow-up, Jane, in terms of an action plan, to what extent do you think diversionary activities could play a part, and if so, what might that be? Because I know from as a as a counsellor, you know, counsellors will receive lots of reports of sort of varying types of activities, some of which causes residents concern. But in addition to advising residents to report any concerns about sort of criminality to the police via 101, I'm conscious that some of the infrastructure that used to be present in terms of youth services is no longer there. So in terms of, even if as ward teams we want to commission a service or some activity, then it's not as easy as it might have otherwise have been in the past. What learning do you think we can take from other areas who may have be further ahead than we are in terms of that kind of action plan to again, you know, not to start off by demonizing, but looking at the causes and what we can do to address them.
Okay, so again, we do have access to some funding, again through the Office of the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, because some funding has been made available specifically for diversionary activities. So we're working with them to look at what's available and what we can bid for. There is also the Community Safety Services Fund that the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner makes available. So again, that's another pot of money that, you know, wards can bid for themselves for access to some of that funding if they can think of something specifically that might work within an area. Interestingly, one of the pieces of work that we've been doing around some of this work, particularly relating to youth-related issues, has been around looking at what children and young people respond to and who they respond to. And it's quite obvious that we're seeing a picture where quite often young people won't respond necessarily to an authority figure, a PCSO or COVID support marshal, giving them a piece of advice, but they will adhere to it if their football coach tells them. So again, this is where, you know, some of those activities are important, because quite often children will take, you know, what their coach says, which may be the exact same message that a PCSO has given them the day before, but they'll somehow take it off the football coach and not from a PCSO. So again, you know, part of the work that we're doing is looking at what's on offer and available to young people over the holiday period, particularly with a view to the summer, because hopefully we are going to have a cracking hot summer and lots of time spent outdoors. So we are doing that work to look at what's available and making sure we have those conversations with some of the sports clubs to make sure that they can help us by reiterating some of those messages, which is where I say the comms thing, you know, does really play a massive part.
Thank you. I'll bring Councillor Vassy in a minute and Councillor Baker with some supplementaries. I just wanted to ask Andy, in terms of Jane's point around messaging and how sort of young people might not be as receptive to advice from an authority figure than as they would from someone, a football coach or whoever. I just wondered what from your crew's experience, Andy, in terms of particularly dealing with the sort of campfire issues that I know we've had in my ward and elsewhere, what the response has been and what kind of approach your teams are using when sort of confronting those kind of issues?
Yeah, it's a really valid point around that ability. Sometimes the fire and rescue service to be able to engage at a different level, I would say, and it's something that they're fairly successful with. So what we're doing with regards to the deliberate fires that have been caused in the Reefton Pass, and particularly around the Knavesmire area, is that's where the crews will be going out, along with police colleagues, PCSOs and police officers, to engage. But the objective really is to take that stance, the view that we're not here to really make things difficult in terms of that prosecution route or that sort of activity, if that was even relevant. It's much more about the conversation around that environment, the safe practice, the risk it faces to the individual, much along the prevention line. We will talk to people about how to make sure that that fire is fully extinguished if they did choose to do it. And that's a very fine balance between saying, don't start a fire, don't have a fire in this location, and then we are almost condoning it by saying, if you do, this is how to put it out. But what we do find is that very often people will be out early morning, very often walking, dog walking, and they will find a fire that has been the remains of a fire, call the fire service, and it's a very small incident that's out. So, if we can help people understand how to operate safely, but again, the focus is about engaging with that community and saying, don't start the fires in the first place. I think one of the things that we offer as a fire and rescue service worth mentioning as well is our life course, whereby we engage with people who've been identified through the referral process to come on a youth number of weeks where they engage in those station-based activities, so very much around the practical elements of the fire and rescue service. And we've found that to be quite successful. But again, it has been impacted on by the COVID, so it's something that we'd look to lift up. We also have a cadet scheme which operates from Selby within the York and Selby district. But again, that's something that we'd look to develop in the future as well. And I think there's an opportunity, just to finish off, to say that, there's more broader activities that the Fire and Rescue Service would be keen to be involved in. So some of the things we've done wider across the county is football activities, where crews have actually arranged, football events to engage with the local community. And really, that's the icebreaker to then enter into the dialogue and start to distract from some of the activities we've talked about this evening.
That's a good idea. I might pursue that one. I know Councillor Vassey, then Councillor Baker raised their physical hands. Councillor Vassey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased to hear the last little block of conversation there from Jane explaining that there's funding available for what she called diversionary activities, to what we've just heard from Andy about ways in which the services can engage with young people. And I think it would be very helpful, certainly I would find it hugely helpful as a councillor, if at the next meeting we got a much clearer idea of what these opportunities are and how ward councillors can get involved and play their part in helping to build those bridges between communities and the services and all the various other players. Because we know that a certain amount of reported bad behaviour is people being bored. We know that a certain amount of it are older people just finding it weird seeing young people out and about. And we need to do more than, my feeling is that we need to do more than see it as activities as a diversionary thing, but also as an engagement thing of giving younger people a way of having an investment and understanding what the services do, what the council does. And hearing Andy talking about having a football match that creates a context where people can get to talk to each other, plays to all of that. When we're 4 or 5 years old, we get a chance to sit in a fire engine. And for a little while, that makes us feel like, oh, this is part of my life and this is what goes on. And I think as we grow older, maybe we lose that link, and things that we do to build that back are massively important, I think, to creating a sense of community. So I would really welcome if others agree that we have a more in-depth look at this and how councillors can play a constructive role.
Definitely. Councillor Baker.
Just that, a comment really in terms of the activities and football. The Yorkshire, it's called the Yorkshire Football Coaching Club that goes on at Millthorpe School. Hundreds and hundreds of children attend this football coaching club during the half term, the holidays, and on a weekly basis. But in the 10 plus category, there's a few 10-year-olds, possibly a couple of slightly younger teenagers, and that's it. That, and I'll be happy to speak to them about it. And I've always wondered, why aren't there more older teenagers or that middle band of 13 to 15? So it is definitely a gap, and it would be great to be able to support and to develop. What was the fund you said again, Jane? I'm sorry. What that ward councillors could apply to?
The Community Safety Services Fund.
Right. Okay. With a specific project idea.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got one more hand, and then there's one question I was going to ask, and I don't have any more hands. So, are members happy for us to crack on, or do people want a 5-minute break? If you put your hand up like that, I'll assume you want a 5-minute break. If you don't, I'll crack on. Okay, let's carry on. Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you, and apologies for having to nip out of the meeting earlier, Chair, when I had a pending question, which I'm now going to get to. Can I ask you, Lindsay, about the difficulties you have in investigating issues relating to coercive control? And I understand we've got James Gilchrist here, because I'd like to ask him a question about how the council deals with coercive control. It's part of the domestic abuse bill, coercive control. Does it create any specific issues in that sometimes it's very hard to evidence?
Lindsay?
Thank you. I think domestic abuse perpetrators can be incredibly clever at what they do, which means that there are some inherent challenges in terms of tackling domestic abuse, particularly where you are in a position whereby victims are minimising some of those incidents. So to that extent, I don't think controlling and coercive behaviour is any different to other forms of domestic abuse. There are some challenges around victims coming forward and victims having trust and confidence to support a prosecution. But again, that's very similar across all types of domestic abuse. Jane, I'm not sure if there's anything that's coming from your local fortnightly meetings specifically on that issue that you would want to come in with.
Yeah, so it's coercive control and stalking and harassment are two priorities that are within the domestic abuse strategy for York and North Yorkshire. So these are things that we are focusing on. We're also looking, because of the difficulties and getting the message out, and particularly around coercive control, it's something that I know IDAS are very, very keen to work with us on getting information out, and their comms are absolutely second to none in terms of the innovative programs that they put out on a very regular basis around some of these issues. So we do link, we tend to let them take the lead around comms in domestic abuse, because the advantage is that as an organisation that is working directly with victims, they have a much better handle really on how to get some of those messages across in a way that is easily related to those victims themselves, and will make them more willing to report. So we're also looking, as part of the work that we're doing around the bill going forward, at how we can bring back some better engagement with our professionals. We used to have quite active forums, and obviously, like everything else, things have had to go on hold a little bit due to COVID. We have been holding those as a virtual meeting, but that's, you know, it's not as engaging as having a face-to-face session. So again, that's something that we will be looking at. And again, coercive control is something that we've highlighted as a topic that we want to really push out there with professionals, because at the end of the day, it's, you know, we rely very much on a number of services that are fulfilling frontline roles, whether that be social workers or teachers, to have that strong awareness and understanding so that they're able to pick up where things like that may be happening to somebody.
I don't know if James, you want to add
I've got a question specifically for James, but that's incredibly helpful, James, because I think that kind of goes to the core of the question that I want to ask James, as well as social workers and teachers. What training is being put in place for housing officers? And I'm working on 2 cases at the moment where women who are fleeing coercive control domestic abuse have been turned down for housing because there's no evidence. And the Home Office are also doing the same thing. So it's not just a council issue, but it is particularly concerning when women are going to the council and they're being turned down for emergency housing on the grounds that they can't evidence any physical injuries or police call-outs.
Jane was waving at me, so
Yeah,
I don't know whether Jane
I'll pick this up and then James can add to it if he wants to add something further to it. So as part of the domestic abuse bill, there is a much greater emphasis around how the services work together across the authority to deal with domestic abuse. So one of the things that I have been doing is linking in with Michael Jones around, because, you know, obviously he's managing housing as the interim AD at the moment. So I've been linking in with Michael to look at how we can increase training and awareness amongst our HMOs. That is a gap that I have already identified. So what I did when the domestic abuse bill was first circulated was I went through and produced a sort of test really against where we were in relation to all of those aspects, and housing was an area that I did highlight as something that we need to focus on. I also think, because it's a long time, I'm aware it's a very long time since we've really run some significant training for our services in the council around domestic abuse. So I think it's timely with the bill coming out and the fact that we've got funding aligned to it, which is absolutely ripe for using for training purposes, to refresh that and to make sure that we get that training rolled out. We've seen a lot of things emerging and much more national awareness around issues that are significant factors. We also, because there have been 3 domestic homicides in wider North Yorkshire, obviously we've got the benefit of the learning from those, so we can see again where training would have been helpful in terms of making sure that professionals really understand those issues and have got all of that information there. So that's something that we're really going to be significantly investing on within the council going forward.
I mean, that's hugely reassuring.
Thanks, Jane. I don't, James, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, excuse me, I was just going to say that I think, as Jane and Lindsay have identified, that the identification but also the response is dependent on the whole organisation understanding it, and I think that's, you know, James quite nicely summed up actually how we need to address that, both in terms of identification but also in terms of our response, which is what Councillor Pavlovich's question was about.
Yeah, and I think it's about you know, working from the presumption that you actually believe somebody rather than disbelieve them as the default.
Okay, thanks for that. And that may well be an issue. Well, obviously it's an issue that straddles both housing and community safety, and maybe something as this piece of work progresses, it might be something we want to return to as a committee. I've got a question for Lindsay. not going into the sort of specifics of the particular speeding issue that the public speaker raised, I know from sort of my casework that particularly when the roads were quieter, there was much greater awareness of speeding because it was more obvious, and with more people cycling, maybe after having not cycled for many years, it can act as a deterrent for people who would otherwise cycle but don't feel safe on the roads. And obviously, the council has and the police have a sort of an established process in terms of identifying issues, monitoring speeding, and then looking at either a sort of an engineering intervention or a community speed watch intervention, and the various potential approaches. I just wondered what your experience had been sort of through lockdown and through the various interludes in lockdown, as to how successful or otherwise we are being in changing behaviours, because I'm conscious that we can't have someone with a speed camera on every corner, and it is about changing behaviours and promoting more responsible driving in the minority of people who don't drive responsibly. So I was grateful for your observations on kind of where we are with that seemingly intractable battle.
Absolutely. I think it was this forum last time where I talked about some of the challenges that we'd seen through particularly the first lockdown in terms of the speeds that were being recorded. So less traffic on the roads, but some significant speeding offences. Speeds of up to 124 miles an hour on some of our dual carriageways through the county. So the A64 being one of those key routes. So we continue to see that theme, certainly during lockdown 1. In terms of where we are currently at, again, all of our deployments of the safety camera vans are based from the research done through the 95 Alive partnership to make sure that we are targeting those routes where we know that we have had people that have either been killed or seriously injured. And I think this is where it comes back to the point made right at the start of the meeting by your member of the public, in terms of we would absolutely encourage members of our communities to report their concerns, because that is what starts that process in terms of assessing the risk at certain locations. So if we do have areas within communities that people are particularly concerned about, and taking the point at the start of the meeting as one absolutely prime example, then what can we do jointly through the 95 Alive partnership to not only address the concerns in that locality, but also to influence that wider driver behaviour. And I think there has been an absolute focus on that during COVID because of some of the extremes that we've seen in terms of speeds, but also in terms of driver behaviour, which there are some occasions where that has been particularly poor, and I know they've been well documented through some of our social media channels. But yeah, it's absolutely highlighted some of the standards of driving which have fallen far, far below the standard that we would expect to see on our roads.
I don't know whether sort of Jane, amongst the sort of panoply of comms, there's a comm stream for everything at the moment, whether you think at some point that is an issue that would lend itself to the kind of sort of targeted and in some cases quite sort of novel approaches to communicating messages that have worked out, really worked quite well during the pandemic.
Absolutely. As I said, I think, when I went through my report, I certainly think that the comms messaging has been one of our most powerful tools during COVID. Certainly, I can see from the number of hits that we're getting on social media, the fact that we've got the ability to share that across all partners. So, we agree these comms messages, working alongside the comms colleagues within the police, fire and rescue, and all of our partners as appropriately. So it means that when we do share messages, they're widely shared. So again, I think, it's something that if we are seeing issues around speeding arise, then it's something that we can certainly look at from a comms perspective. Absolutely.
No, that'd be great. And I know that there are sort of many interested sort of groups across the city who sort of campaign for cycle safety as well as pedestrian safety, that I'm sure I'll be happy to get involved in that. Let's look for any other hands from members, any other final questions. Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Chair. It's not a question, just to comment on that point. I think it would be really helpful if at every opportunity we interlinked messaging on transport and safety and road safety, so much more so that it becomes embedded. And what we do have, I believe, and I don't know how to go about this more formally, is a council that's committed to the transport hierarchy. And if this, which puts pedestrians and cyclists at the top, and then public transport and this, I can't name, I should know it off by heart, I'm getting to know it off by heart, but private car use is lower down on the pyramid of the transport hierarchy. And I think it would just be really helpful if at every opportunity in comm strategies we started to communicate that better, and that people understood more about what that means, so that we do move towards a society that is more accepting of streets for people rather than car dominated.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Okay, I can see no further hands, so I'd like to say a very big thank you to Lindsay and Andy and Jane for taking 2 hours out to talk to us and share information with us. I've certainly found it incredibly helpful. In terms of kind of actions arising, we talked about earlier on the data on domestic violence, and I think probably a combination of Jane with input from Lindsay is necessary. If you can share any further data you have that sets it in context, that'll be really helpful. We talked about hate crime statistics, and I think Lindsay mentioned there might be some more sort of granular data available, and if so, perhaps sort of through Jane, you can feed that through just so members have a sort of better idea of the types of hate crime that are being reported. And then finally, the discussion around diversionary activity opportunities for members to be thinking about, and if there are ideas and potential projects, there may be some funding support for those. I know, Jen, you mentioned what that was called. If you can sort of ping a link round or any further information, just so members are aware of it and can look at it in more detail.
Yes, I can send the link to that funding, yeah. and obviously, I would welcome any ideas that ward members have around activities. Then do feel free to drop me an email and have a chat about it. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, I think it sort of speaks to Councillor Baker's point around engaging with young people beyond the age of 11. I know from activities that we've commissioned in our ward, thinking it would be great for the teenagers to do. No teenagers appeared. Sort of 8 to 11-year-olds were thrilled with the skate park, but the older kids weren't. So I think we're all learning what does and doesn't work, and it'd be really useful to share ideas and experience as to what works and what doesn't. Okay, so that concludes that agenda item. Thank you very much for your input. Agenda item 5 is urgent business. I have not been notified of any urgent business. The next meeting of this committee is due to have an informal meeting on the 4th of May. I'm not sure whether that meeting will be going ahead. Judging by an email I received earlier, I think there'll be something else happening on that date. So if the chair and vice chair and I will speak offline and figure out when our next informal meeting is going to be. We're due to have an informal meeting in June, but I think we could do with having an informal meeting probably before June to have a discussion around affordable housing or private developments.
Yes.
Do you want to add anything, Councillor Pavlik?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Chair, I think we do need to update the committee on the work that, the sterling work that you've done.
Not just me.
Well, I've sat in, but you've written all the notes up, so if the notes are rubbish, they're down to you. Yes, sometime probably during May, with a view to then bringing it forward to a public meeting at some time relatively quickly thereafter.
Yeah. I think July is our next scheduled public, so that's sort of what we're in for.
Yeah.
Yep, no, that's fine. Well, you and I can get our heads together about that. So there being no further business, I'll draw the meeting to a close. Thank you very much, everyone.